We've arrived at the end, almost the end anyways, and I wanted to kind of tell you guys a story about how this all came about for me, how this retreat, this topic, how it all arrived here for you today. It's been something that has been brewing and simmering for quite some time now. About 10 years ago, actually, when I first discovered the apparition site that I told you about in Ohio, I, at the same time, started praying the rosary regularly. And something was taking place within me. Call it a stirring, call it a rousing. Both of those things don't even really accurately describe it. It was a fire, I guess, growing inside of me. And the feeling was just so powerful and so overwhelming and so consuming that I didn't really know what was going on. So I remember running to my pastor at the time, and I just kind of threw my hands up in the air. I told him what was going on, and I'm like, what do I do with this? It was just burning. And he began to talk to me about St. Francis of Assisi. And St. Francis of Assisi, a lot of you know, he heard the Lord say to him, "Rebuild my church." And so he went around fixing up all these church buildings until later he realized that God was actually calling him to rebuild the people of God, the church. And that's when he began preaching and teaching. But it was odd that Father was talking to me about St. Francis of Assisi that day, because my middle name is Francis. I was named after my grandfather, my Grandpa Frank, so it's actually the man's version. It's spelled I-S instead of E-S. And Francis was actually the confirmation name that I took. And so Francis has always been very special to me. So it was ironic that day that he was talking to me about Francis. And as we talked, he started telling me about another Francis. Yep, you guessed it, St. Francis de Sales, the one I've been referencing the last 4 sessions. Come to find out, I wasn't very familiar with him at the time, but he's the patron saint of writers. And so Father asked me, or suggested to me, to ask for his intercession. He actually also gave me a drawing of him, and he gave me a book, St. Francis de Sales' Introduction to the Devout Life. And that book, God had been taking me into the garden at that point, and when I opened that book, I could feel the garden, and everything started to make sense. That book is actually the first spiritual book that was written for the laity. At the time, most spiritual books were written for religious. And so that was special for its own time, and I kind of felt like it burned. I mean, every word was, I get it, I get it, I get it. God took me deeper and deeper into the garden after that point and taught me more and more. He healed me in the garden, like I had said earlier. And over the years, this has been something that has been culminating. I guess you could say that I have felt called to share this with you today. And friends, you've been called too. And not just called to hear it. You've been called to the garden in order that you might become a temple of God's glory. Not just for the sake of your own salvation, not just for the sake of giving God glory, but for the sake of everyone that you encounter, so that the sweetness of your virtue might attract other souls, and the light of the God who's dwelling within you might inspire other souls. Friends, rebuilding the temple is rebuilding the church. At the beginning, we talked about how discouraging it can be sometimes, and we mentioned, that this is the safe haven. But this isn't just the safe haven, this is the answer. After being called within, after being given the blueprint, after being strengthened in the Spirit, you have an obligation, a responsibility to rebuild, to bring back the garden. Because here's the thing, that's how the kingdom is to come upon the earth, in hearts. Your light has a place in this world. It has a place to fill. It's destined to make an impression on certain souls, many souls. Your spark, although it seems insignificant, is meant to light another spark, which lights another spark, until the entire world is consumed with the love of God. God called you here to rebuild. He called you to the victory. Not just your victory specifically, but the greater victory for the church at large, the triumph. Next year is the 100-year anniversary of Fatima, where she talked about the triumph. You have a place in that. You have a responsibility, a job. You are called to participate in that triumph. And here's how. The devil is working so hard these days, trying to dismantle the church, pervert the truth, keeping souls in bondage. But who will fight against him? Who will embrace the light within that scatters darkness? Who will let Christ reign so that others may come and see him? In a world where sin is downplayed, embraced, made into law, who will pursue holiness? Who will go in here to change out there? In here lies the answer to everything out there. Everything. Sometimes I think, we get so focused and so caught up in everything that's going on out there. The problems, the relationships, it's one thing after the other. And we lose focus of our journey, we lose focus of our relationship, and we end up at the gate, on the outer limits, and we're shouting over the distance to God, begging him, fix this, help me. But maybe what we need to do is get to the center. Maybe what we need to do is focus on uniting with him, being in union with him. Because like St. Paul said, it's no longer I who live, it's Christ who lives in me. I don't need to shout at that point. I don't need to do anything at that point. I just need to be. Christ lives in me. I can take Christ to whoever needs Christ. We don't need to shout over the distance. We don't need to beg. Because when we're that close and that joined, he hears the heart. No words are necessary. He knows the heart. So the answer to everything that we suffer, to every trial we have, is right there. And so the reason why I said at the beginning that this garden is so important is because this is how it's all going to change. At the beginning we talked about coming to that safe haven, and it may have seemed like I was talking about escaping it, going within, we can kind of escape it. But we're not escaping it, we're fixing it. We're rebuilding the church of God, one heart at a time, one garden at a time. And so I just want to encourage you, when you do go to the garden, when you leave here today, Focus on that, and everything else will fall into place. Be bold. Be bold in your journey. We don't need to tiptoe around this. We don't need to tiptoe around that. Here's the map. Holy loves the direction. Pruning, digging up weeds, practicing virtue, welcome detachment. And when you're praying, let your will subside. And you'll find it. Before we leave today, there are team members who are willing and open to pray with you before you head back out there. If there's a special intention, or maybe you just need strength, make sure you see TA or any of the other team members. As for me, my husband and I have to get on a plane in Cleveland that leaves at 7, so I won't be available to chit-chat, but I do truly want to thank each and every one of you for coming today and for taking the time out of what's a really gorgeous Saturday from the looks of things to be inside here with this. God thanks you. So bless you.